Hello everyone, today we talk about Republican Roman rewards and decorations concerning discipline, but the actual, objects that constituted the badge of honor and of the encomium, or properly the rewards for the behavior displayed in war, right? Constituting actually a very important aspect in the life of the Roman soldier. Naturally, we know less about the earlier times, so also banally from an iconographical point of view, there is less. I can show you most of the pictures here come from sort of later hitmen. We're still in part in late Republican times, but things did not change too much in terms even of phalerae, and in the sense I could find too few let's say copyright freely speaking about, like, for example, even all the coronae, the various crowns, right? But the essence is really the same. We've seen how in this world actually these symbols, think about the torque, right, were shared among various peoples, and they had also some interesting readaptation in the Roman military. We will see how. But the core concept at the root of this, especially from Marian times onwards, right, being very, very evident, especially considering the professional character that the Roman army takes on, so also the legionary becoming something really distinguished from, let's say, even the quasi-tribal, let's say, clanic even way of thinking someone's participation to war, which is, again, an important step. We've seen it in the videos about the Roman conquest of Italy in the development of any military, right, passing from essentially a tribal, non-professional, non-permanent to in fact, a statal, professional, permanent military system, right, is means really, really a lot. We know too few about the earlier times. We will make videos about these badges, also as far as probably the earlier times are concerned. We can get a bit more into specifics. Today we talk about sort of the better documented times, looking mostly at the meaning that this had for these soldiers. Because, and this happens often in the history of Western civilization, you can argue that actually it is sort of a constant, right? You find some enlightened elites that give the chance of redemption to some desperate, marginated masses that have the way of making it out of this, like often through blood and sacrifice and suffering, but creating like a new order that really takes civilization to a next level. And definitely for an average plebeian filing rank soldier of this period, say post-Marian, would be enthusiastic still in, say, distinguishing himself for chances of promotion, of elevation. It was all a career within the Roman legion, as you know, that would bring you to become an NCO, even the last of the officers, as the primipilus, for example. And that was also still felt in let's say in a broader national sense, meaning the idea of a people asserting itself collectively through, in fact, the hierarchy, the imperium borne by the commanders, right? So if we think about the attachment of the proletarian Marian mule to the fiercely oligarchic warlords that were able to offer them, through the same victories, prospect of, for example, land distribution, right, through new conquests in other lands. And so the system was still very, very functional. We will see how in more archaic times this, of course, was still there. There had always been in Rome essentially an aristocratic, if not oligarchic, regime at all times. So this kind of view was alive, right, in the quite strongly in the awareness of every Roman fighter. They could even rise to the greater top. In post-modern times, this makes leverage morally, emotionally on the probably the least of the strata of the population. That so in the military service, that true chance of redemption from severe misery, right? The Romans, of course, had high standards of living for the ancient world, but in absolute terms, of course, like the average person everywhere lived pretty miserably, without exception. So what the empire was giving them was something that is the same you can see among the auxiliaries, but we have to talk about them more, like this point of reference and chance of redemption in front of God, right? And with tangible results that the Imperium was literally bringing them individually. And so these badges were actually a symbol of that, like the manifestation through their meaning of that divine favor that literally had descended down the line till the last soldier, right? The Imperator is just a medium of the divinity. I mean, he is the guy who has, of course, to receive it at the most important level, and that, in this sense, receives all the moral force also from the lower strata in virtue of his own capacity. But without that sum of individual forces, there couldn't be the Imperium. So these badges, these distinctions, were crucial to motivate the troops and making them perform those acts of valor that, say, in the military are just always clothed like and shrouded in this sense of true divinity, right? In a very modern secular context, right? It's that same meaning that lives on because it cannot be switched off, right? In spite of our, say, the erasing that most of this has been done purposely. So the so-called Republican times, soldiers were generally rewarded also in other ways. For example, through the loot, the Praeda, captured from the enemy. This could be consistent in many circumstances, both individually and collectively. It was a widespread custom that, for example, if an enemy city would surrender without fighting, the loot would go just to the officers of the Roman army, right? While in case of storming, right, in arms, the Praeda would be divided instead among the soldiers, which is a very strong, let's say, motivation for having lots of men willing to be more tactically and strategically aggressive for that matter. Yes, you would risk your life in, say, to make things just at least in perspective. You could die during a long siege, because of some epidemic. So this is not really something that is decided upon simply the moral of the troop, unfortunately. But not just that. But generally speaking, like the idea of seizing immediately, being up to that kind of exploit, right? Because in that way you could get the spoils as well, was very, very attractive for many soldiers, especially in times, in fact, in which there technically wasn't a real salary as we intended. Actually, the Roman army was paid, as you know, since the 4th century BC, right? It didn't begin with Marius. Even after that, the payment could be una tantum, not necessarily like regular, as you would expect. There were donativa that were given, as you know, every once in a while, depending on the circumstance. But definitely was still the idea that, after all, you were paid just as a sort of compensation for the practical means that you had to provide yourself, even though when this happened, the soldier would have still being partly responsible for the equipment that was provided to him by the state, because that's what really got down to originally. Like there truly never was like a time in history in which, I don't know, the humble a status went from he left his home like with his own, produced scutum and gladius and cheese and sausages on his back, and saying hi to his wife and children, and this will do for whatever the campaign would last. Like this, perhaps in incredibly archaic times, to a degree with which, of course, the Roman aristocracy would provide with most of the actual logistical support, the supplies, etc. So that's for another video, actually. But it's obvious that in a time in which the army was not like a permanent thing, organically speaking, in terms of units and professional career and so on, there would be centurions made out of merit during a campaign, that when the war was over, they were disbanded, and when enlisting once again, they would have had to restart from zero, aside from the experience that could help them in that new context. So given that war was relatively more exceptional, at least in certain times, also the chances of looting were sort of more, what the soldier would aim at more, proportionally more, right? So this did play an important part in the Roman conquest of the Mediterranean and beyond. In case of deserving, right, worthy behavior, the soldiers could be provided with, for example, additional food, additional rations, right, or clothing, or other goods, gifts of a certain value, also in gold or in silver, right? In exceptional circumstances, you would be, however, also decorated, and the decoration was sort of the most distinctive badge, the one that wouldn't be hopefully lost or worn out, that had really a deep symbolical value, as we will see now, and it really heightened the guy receiving that in front of the troop. And this was also a way, in fact, perhaps to distinguish veterans, men of valor, and so on, in times in which, in fact, the armies were not permanent, and these troops might have been again disbanded, and the various individuals recruited at some other point, and at that point surely showing off, like proving that they were the best ones around which the various units could gather, right? Many types of decorations were connected, of course, also from the ornaments subtracted to the enemy. The collars or torques, right, or the bracelets, the armillae, in gold and silver, were a typical ornament, as you know, of Central European populations like the Celtic ones, born especially by the war bands, right? And so by those warriors that had a sort of semi-professional, well, not properly professional outlook, but we talked a lot about Celtic warfare, war bands, and so on, and that in fact were loaded themselves in spoils from places like were actually richer than them, and brought with them also stunted. This is typical, actually, the more nomadic the place, right, the more that is the case. For example, in the steppes, much of a person's individual wealth was showed off as much as possible, brought with them, because they were always on the move anyway, and so if there was really nowhere you would have left that. So for somebody living in a war band, that was something similar, even in a sedentary context like a Gallic one. Now, I should make, as I was saying, much more in-depth videos, because the question of the torque is sort of more complex than it seems. Like the idea, like you still find in some Roman history books, is that such torques, at least as a legionary, or the armillae as well, as a legionary decoration, would appear in Rome for the first time around 230 BC, as the result of some war booty following the triumphal parade, right? The truth being much more complex. First of all, what was the meaning of this object? Like, why did peoples like the Celts use this prominently, especially in their military? Well, we explained the sort of the deal why they would carry it with them and why they were prominent, but the meaning really was very much connected with the usual, let's say, it has a disciplinary sense regarding the holy combat, right? Self-sacrifice, and the fact that essentially your life as part of warrior brotherhoods did not really belong to you anymore, but first of all, let's say, to the deity, through your leader, right? And the sense of the torque is literally like a chain. It's something that, as we've seen also in the videos about the berserkers and the Ulfenars, was connected in the Middle Ages with this sort of collar, like in a sort of beast-like fashion. That was, however, that's not much of the Christian demonization of that practice. In many ways, medieval knights did very similar things, but it's the actual meaning that it had at the beginning. The idea that once you had essentially tied this thing around you, around your neck, properly your vital, say, chain, right, your vital axis in the head, the chest, where they thought the spirit would reside, your life, first of all, did not belong to you anymore, right? It belonged to the deity. You were one as a single body with the unit and the leader and God, right? And so, you know that routinely the Celts would just kill someone every once in a while to remember within the band, because they had incredibly violent and traumatic ways of selection, right, to maintain up the standards, like human sacrifice. It was absolutely normal, right? It was done through the same combat, right? The same concept of the Roman spolia opima, for example, derives from that. It's essentially a human sacrifice, but always understood in the form of killing a worthy enemy in combat. In fact, Titus Malnius Torquatus is a famous hero in the Roman sagas. Why? Because he kills, like it's like the Roman David, right? Except he actually kills his giant enemy, this enormous goal, into hand-to-hand combat, and strips him of his torque, right, wearing him himself, and the nickname, the cognomen, remains, because this is a very famous example, say, the notorious example of this Roman acquisition of the torque. But the point being somehow deeper in the sense that, so what, didn't the Romans have these things on their own? Why do you find the torque typically mostly among the Celts, the Germans, the Iranians? Well, the truth being that these were still tribal peoples, and in many ways they were less secular and modern, so they more primitively and traditionally, because of the lack of central institutions, so a uniform discipline coming from the top, etc., like motivate themselves through this sort of very, very down the line traumatic and gory mechanisms that had, in a sense, just to initiate the person entering the war bands, first of all, annihilating him as a human being. These people turned into literal animals, and as such, they were treated by everybody, right? Not just within the band, but also outside of that. And only through the fine selection of a literal, the path of the way of the left hand, the way where the fire of death blazes, I made a video on this, so mostly dying most of the times, but it would be selected like by slaughtering somebody else, hopefully also gaining part of these trophies so that they could be considered like worthy in a ways, and or associating like with multiple of them, because that was also the case. There were different decorations in this regard, and elevating themselves to a level that hopefully could be the one of the same leader that they were all extremely competitive with, and at that point maybe founding from this comitatus an actual zippe and starting to live in a sort of free, noble way, with somebody else working for them and with other warbands that they're following. So with younger, experienced people, they had to restart it over again. And next to you, like the Greek veterans who had made it out of this meat grinder of some sort. And the military is ruled this. So among the Greeks and the Romans, actually, certain symbols were still present, like bracelets, where you can't argue that at some point throughout even the process of statalization of a Roman culture that was still, again, very close, as we're just remembering, especially the Roman one historically, like especially with the speed in which this change happened to the warrior and tribal background. The Romans were excited by blood, like, they had extremely close ties with the central European cultures. They had made their own. After all, the single most, Apollonian of the imperial ideology, of the Indo-European ideologies. So this is the Romans did the same things at some point. Like some Latin warrior would have had this signs of distinctions back in the day. The same italics migrating from Central Europe at some point would have borne the same things, because in that point at which the Indo-Europeans were not even yet distinguished from the original cauldron, they all had this stuff, right? So with the expansion, the expansion of the Roman military from Italy abroad and fighting mostly, especially in Europe, against populations like the Celts that had remained more tribal and with those kind of decorations, the Romans sort of reabsorbed in a more, standard homogeneous fashion these kind of distinctions that, however, had always been there in a way or another. That universal meaning was extremely clear, right? We're not talking about extraneous cultures. These guys were essentially cousins, and they were much more similar than what, say, also, but like 19th century ideologies tended to force on us, right? Surely it was the hallmark of a warrior, right? And the main point of besides the value that could be attributed banally from a material way to the same object, that was of, again, precious metal that, as you know, was connected with the gods, like gold, silver. They all refer to the age of gods, the age of eras, right? So this metal was literally believed to ensnare you, to literally pour the divinity within you, right? And controlling you in that way, binding you. Like once you had been in a Roman legion, you wouldn't come out of that. You were a different person or a different human being, right? In the war bands, you literally changed name, right? And so it's obvious that when you had become a soldier, also in Roman society at this point, you truly had become something else in front of the rest of society, especially with the professionalization of the same army, right? And the increasing distinction from the rest of the population, right? But the most important thing in this sense of the trophies was their exhibition when coming back home, right? This was initially like also the most important aspect. Look, I killed a Gaul and I brought back, and there were lots of even parts of, the enemy body that were carried actually as a trophy. Again, this polyopia was considered as the same human sacrifice back in the day. And the Romans, we know that they loved decapitations. They had some sort of incredibly fierce and fanatic, again, warrior tribal mentality that had never been put down, even in the incredibly violent discipline that they had received. And those who had engineered this were perfectly aware of this, that they needed the disciplined, cold soldier managing to fight in collective formation. But in order for him to be excellent, they still needed a bit like subordinated to this, the individualistic warrior, right, of the rougher tribal background that the Italics had been up to very few centuries before. They still were in many cases. We talk about the Republican times, where the more primitive populations of the Italian peninsula, to truly, again, exalt this divine potential. It's, however, when the Roman military becomes, as we've said, permanent and professional to the fullest extent, that these devices become true and proper decorations, like as standardly speaking. Naturally, there had been moments in Roman history when, I don't know, during the Second Punic War, it had truly been a full, de facto, fully professional lifestyle. There had been people who had been in the arms for an entire generation. This can be said of lots of ever more impoverished Roman citizens, peasants who say only perspective of sort of making something better than what awaited them at home was to regularly enlist in the consular armies, even in that frustrating way that we remember before, aside from the fact that many were just, the majority was enlisted by force at this point, but also not really having that guarantee of continuity or recognition. For example, somebody's military curriculum and experience in the previous wars, in the previous armies, that they had even to restart from zero. Okay, it was mostly in fact, these centurions that led the most combatistic, I don't know how to say that, veteranistic instances of military reform, because they knew that, I mean, they literally would see people dying in a wasted way because of this lack of permanent cadres, of NCOs, of officers, and so on. Also, the famous phalerae were of Celtic origin. These were discs or half crescents in metal, artistically worked, often in gold or silver as well, that reproduced, unsurprisingly, figures from mythology, mostly gods, right? And so forces that were all part of, say, of the whole universe, and concretizing themselves in particular ones that also the soldier could a bit maybe customize in a sense. They would be mostly given, but there was a rich symbology and semantic behind all this. Some phalerae represented, I don't know, the Medusa, for example. Sometimes instead Apollonian figures, right? So this depended on what probably also the soldier was perceived to be like, somebody that was more chthonic or more Uranic in essence, right? We've seen how every Roman unit itself had its own character, its own symbol, its own genius, right? Protecting them, literally a spirit that was part of the whole, like Catholic, say, divinity, that, however, as far as that unit was concerned, like embodied itself in it with those particular characteristics. There could be even tactical specialties of some sort. The phalerae were used also as an ornament on the horse's barding. There was an intimidation purpose to this, because just like, I don't know, peoples we mostly associate with the steppes, right? And so say, oh my god, it's so exotic, whatever. But actually this was done in Europe in the Century world as well. Like, these phalerae would create a sort of scary sound for the enemy, especially consider, I don't know, hundreds of these horses charging against you, with that added to the already, shocking and traumatic experience of resisting a cavalry charge. Like, never think that since ancient cavalry didn't have horse shoeing except the pretty crappy post handles or the fixed saddle, this kind of stirrup, like the shock effect of the charge was poor. Like, ancient cavalry charged like crazy. It is true that, I don't know, the Celts, the Romans didn't really have something like feudal cavalry, strictly meant. Like, the only people, like in Europe, that really had a feudal society had been Macedon, right? And then you can really find the top in that direction. But again, this was really a thing, right? There was a magic purpose, like it's just like the hissing arrows, or again the bells attached to the barding of the steps people. It's like the sound produced by that random tinkling was meant to be the same voice of the divinity manifesting, right, in this accident, in the product of the impetus of the charge, right? And so everything was called by the knight, in that circus, or the soldier on foot, like also apotropaically speaking, but literally also as participating into the same deity, right, as in the process, right? The prestige of such phalerae was enormous. They were bore on the chest, right? Probably the seat of what was considered like the true origin of most of the force, like of the heart, probably reserved initially to only two knights in Rome. This is very important. Never forget how important cavalry actually was among the Roman citizens since the beginnings of the cities. Was just like in the medieval communes. Like, these were the only people who, contrarily to the principle of you have to still pay for your own equipment, actually the state had to pay for like an extra without any other, because the idea of the imperium contained in the knight was higher than, and that's why the equites in Rome had also those essentially aristocratic privileges in the voting system, in the way they went on war, because they had the resources, morally and materially, to be knights in the first place. Later, the phalerae were recognized also as a decoration to at least the primi ordines of the centurions, that is to say, the highest ranking centurions of the legion. To tell you how important they were, remember that probably these guys were officers, whereas like the others below were considered NCOs. At least it's a bit more of a modern term, but the idea is that these guys could make the jump also socially towards like the officialty, let's say, and that was the highest dimension of that transfigurational redeeming principle that we were talking about at the beginning. Even though these are early imperial finds, some beautiful phalerae in silver found in Lauersfort are preserved at the Römisch-Germanisches Zentralmuseum of Mainz, right? So, well, naturally the Rhine had the highest concentration of troops, as you know. So also archaeologically, we're happy to find the symbols. And again, they are you can Google that. I couldn't use all of these because they're often copyrighted, but the stuff I see at least is abundant. The meanings naturally are varied because there wasn't such a standardization in the figures represented on the phalerae, and we do not even know clearly which characters are depicted on them, divinely, mythologically, and more. Right? You have some guesses. We understand more or less what these forces were conceptually, but also we don't have unfortunately the manual for the explanation. One of the most sought after decorations in the older times had been the golden crown, which means a lot in a regime, in an establishment that, as you know, has essentially refused at least the institutional form of monarchy. The monarchic prerogatives do survive in the Roman magistracies, like in those offices that the nobility held, like maintaining ideally the unity and the cohesion of Rome through their fanatic collective loyalty and disciplined moral standards. Some say that the Golden Crown was of Hellenic Etruscan derivation. As I explained in multiple videos, the ones on the Sol Invictus and the traditional concept of sacred royalty, like the Latins, the Italics had that themselves ingrained, right? The degrees by which, again, yes, the Hellenistic world later on, but the Etruscans, right, to some degree themselves, because the Etruscans weren't ruled just by a single king, as you know, so it may have been by scale sort of more influential in Rome, looking at the Golden Crown, right, that nobody in Rome really could wear, otherwise, and that therefore could not be, they could be bestowed upon just very particular figures, but not in the sense that this could take over Rome in the process. We're truly part again of a broader tradition, and I will make videos specifically on this aspect more. Exceptional acts of bravery were considered worth rewarding the individual with a golden crown. For example, in 361 BC, remember that everything before the 70s, the 80s of the 3rd century BC is history by 50%, the other is myth, and it has a very specific meaning in the myth, historically speaking, so it's not an invention. 361 BC, the dictator Quinctius Pennus, conferred to Titus Manlius, exactly on that occasion which he had struck down the Gaul and used his torque on himself afterwards, a golden crown, right? This was like seen as an enormous feat of bravery, because again the Gaul was enormous, like a giant. The source is Livy 710, by the way, if you're interested. We will be reading that at some point. In 349 BC, the symbolically loaded consul Furius Camillus, in terms of properly civic values, rewarded himself the tribune Valerius Corvus with a golden crown and 10 oxen, right? So that's kind of natural rewards as well that would come from in such relatively archaic times, where cattle was quite relevant, especially for the Roman aristocracy in Latium, for having defeated yet another Gallic chieftain in single combat. This is Livy 726 instead, right? And think about this also. I explained this in the video about the Manipur legion versus the Macedonian phalanx. What kind of warfare were the Romans into in the moments in which they were molding the Manipular legion? They weren't fighting the Greeks, right? For all those who think that the Romans invented maniples for defeating the Hellenistic phalanx, this has absolutely nothing to do with it. Not even the hoplites, because again, the Romans were fighting against the Gauls, other Italic tribesmen, and hardly phalanxes, even of the classical hoplitic type. Over time, the donativa would substitute, even if not completely, loot. That is, the commanders would essentially give some amount of wealth, either to a single soldier or to entire units, entire army, depending on the situation, a way just to spur them, but also making more order, like disciplinarily speaking. You can imagine like the mess that followed during looting, and it could also endanger the let's say the same security of the army at a given strategical point. While the decorations were gradually standardized and attributed in an undifferentiated way in function of the, say, status and rank, which could be different things, of the beneficiary, right? Sometimes there were some equites, for example, that chose the centurion's career. So it was not just about plebeians, and this did matter, right, as far as who you were. The idea is that, this enormous military system, just like in the world, like every person is unique, and so you have to reward them adequately for their deeds, right? There are different means of doing this. For example, there is the wooden hasta pura, that is spears not being dipped into blood yet, and that becomes the distinctive decoration of a centurion belonging to the primi ordines, or even characters of higher rank, right? The idea was that this spear would be the symbol of the new status, the new condition that by reaching the primi ordines, the centurions had proven to have achieved, right? And then blood could be spilled, but it was sort of a principle of eternal life, of rejuvenation, like a virginity that is restored in a sense. Also, the crowns, as you know, had famously like a distinction in depending on the specific act of valor carried out. The golden crown would remain a generic decoration, however of ever lesser importance, because times modernize and secularize, and aside from the fact that there is a true monarch at this point, like at least today we talk Republican times, but these would continue. The crown would continue to be used like in the golden fashion. So later on, there was also a greater detachment of these individuals properly from the heroic divine standards of the age of when that was possible, still in a metaphysical dimension. And so it wasn't so like immediately connected with figures of like the heroes of the 4th century BC. All right. There is an exhaustive description of the coronae, the crowns, provided by Aulus Gellius in the Noctes Actice 5-6 that lists the various types, and that's where we know the thing. So there is the corona triumphalis, which is in fact the golden one, originally made of laurel, that now, however, was used just by the higher speakers. That's what you find, I don't know, Caesar or Augustus having that, because that's where the, say, with the stratification of Roman society and just the tendentially monarchic system, like that golden age had risen to, right? This ever more unitary leader, right? In any case, the corona triumphalis was offered still at this point to the victorious generals in those honors connected with the triumph, that in fact had, as you know, that connection with the idea of these guys transcending, becoming Jupiter himself, at least for a given amount of time, achieving that divine status, which however was subordinated to carrying the spolia, in fact, to the same temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus in Rome, And again, we talked this in the video about the Sol Invictus, the symbol of the rising sun and on the red cheeks. It's not just a late Roman thing as people think, not just an Eastern one. It's actually the re-edition of the same belief that had always been existing among these people since ever, right? And so it's really like the top that symbolizes a quite unique condition, metaphysical one, that literally was achieved only within Rome, by the way. I mean, at least it was in the triumph, literally sanctified by the same Rome, right? It's as if the general had won because of in his virtue that had elevated himself to the divine status in combat because of this dramatic exploit that had evidently not changed, had changed the world to an extent, but not the utmost one, and only when, say, reapproaching the source of that power, it was, of course, the temple of Jupiter, in the holiest of the holiest, this was sort of reactivated, right? And, coming ever closer to that, to eventually give back to God what was God, right? As a sacrifice on the temple. It's like when these decorations later on at the imperial funeral were thrown on the pyre by the knights, by the way, galloping around. These things were actually reminiscent of the Aryan steps, like also in the Roman tradition, because without the imperator, that was the medium of God, that was coming back like deified to the same God, to the same Jupiter, like the decorations were thrown back into it, because it was only through God that this could be accomplished, right? And it could have been accomplished, and so that's what you owe to God in the first place. And so this was the utmost sign of deference, of fides, really, that is the hallmark of Romanity, right? Then other coronae were the obsidionalis or graminea, that is the crown that the besieged offered to the general that had freed them. This is interesting because Rome believed also in quite much in the Alexandrine idea that just because of their self-actualization, like the rest of the world would lay their arms and letting them rule over them as the just conquerors. This corona is made of grass, and the latter has grown generally in the place where the siege has taken place, right? In 343 BC, for having broken the Samnitic siege, the liberated legions on that occasion gifted the tribune Publius Decius with a corona obsidionalis of graminea, that is literally the couch grass, which, I don't know if you say it in English, symbolizing essentially the fact that these guys had been entrapped in the dirt, like the siege represented. I mean, the ideal of these armies was to spring out, right, as this new, again, regenerated forces being blocked into a siege and not being able to come of that, like, was not just humiliating because you essentially were admitting the enemy to be stronger than you, but because he had confined you into an earthly, thin-eyed, dirty reality, right? And so, in a way, the crown symbolized this earth in which that was given, like, as the broader territory, the broader control that still this living force had on the dirt to the winner. And to his soldiers, a pound, that is 327 grams of spelt, and a sextarius, that is roughly half a liter, of wine each. We're told this by Livy 737. The Senate gave a corona obsidionalis to Quinctus Fabius Maximus during the Second Punic War for having essentially successfully distanced the Hannibal's forces from the potential. Actually, he would have not done it. I will make videos explaining why. From Rome, right? So from this siege, like from the city, like was under pressure, like in a broader absolute sense, as the new center of the world, from which, in fact, the ecumenical rule would have had to extend. Then we have the corona civica, that is a crown of oak leaves that a citizen donates to another citizen who had saved his life in battle. Right? This was quite relevant because it stressed the citizenship bond between Romans and their primarily military connection, right? In absolute cultural terms, every Roman citizen was such because of his right to bear arms in front of God, and the lifestyle that proved that, especially at this point in history. The oak, the olm sometimes, the olm oak is also called, according to Gellius, had to do with the fact that once upon a time food and nourishment had been drawn from the oaks themselves. The point of the oak, as always in many cultures, including the Roman one, in which the center of the world laid and properly under the oak that was planted in front of the temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus on the Capitoline Hill, was really the symbol of the pillars of the world in the first place. And so the nourishment of every true man, it symbolized the strength of it, like the roots planted in the world. There was a similarity, like even between the oak and the man, right? And so think about Scipio as literally like a baton of some sort. And in 385, the former consul Manlius Capitolinus, and it's not a coincidence in this that the Capitoline aspect is connected with the corona civica made of oak, but the Capitoline oak, that had been accused, by the way, of sedition, and had gone under trial for that, defended himself by listing the merits and the decorations that he had earned, among which as much as 8 coronae civicae, Livy 620, which, of course, in this case, from the caput, from the idea of like the center of Romanity, like a guy who had been rewarded so much for having saved his fellow Roman citizens in combat, in the extreme, the most extreme circumstances, was a great example of civic value and could not be accused of something like sedition, right? There are deeper reasons. I will have to restart some sort of, ancient medieval symbolism, that is, because certain meanings are really crucial in the entire Western tradition. And we have the corona muralis, which is also a golden crown. In 293 BC, the consul Papirius Cursor, gifted with bracelets and coronae muralia, the legate Spurius Nauctus, also 4 centurions, and 1 maniple of Astati for having conquered first the walls of Aquilonia, a Samnite city. Also, he gifted all the equites with bracelets and sort of little horns, like the cornicula, Livy 1044, of silver. Right. This is quite telling because it shows you how within the legionary forces, like Wu was chosen for having accomplished when such decorations had to be properly for actually receiving these decorations properly. Then we have the corona castrensis or ballaris, so connected, as you understand, with the castrum and the vallum. It is also a golden one, representing a trench that the general would grant to the first entering by fighting in the enemy encampment, right? So into castra or valla. During the triumph for the victory over the Samnites, Livy 1046 tells us that, quote, the infantrymen and the knights were just in the parade displaying their honors, like their decorations. There were many coronae, civicae, murales, and vallares. But this was, of course, the point. Like, there were these knights and foot that could display such, say, the recognition of such acts of bravery that they literally embodied, because the sense was that you would have been given this, like this process of rewarding the troops was getting, as we've seen, ever more sort of regularized. I mean, in Livy's times, that this was a much more standardized process than it had been for the centuries that the Roman historian was writing about. Because in a way or another, these guys would have been glorified by their own comrades, by their own the commanders would have had all the reasons to reward these guys, to again increase the, let's say, the esprit de corps, but also the obedience to the same commander was seen as someone who would recognize their value in a fair way, because the idea, as always, was that you didn't have to do that for flattering, nor you had to be tight-fisted about it. The Romans were all about what you deserved, you got, right? And if you didn't deserve it, you didn't get it. So as fair, pragmatically as it could be. Then there is also the corona navalis, that, as you can understand, it's also in this case actually is a golden crown, and it's granted in a maritime combat, right, to the first who has boarded, of course, the enemy ship. And the crown, of course, is decorated with the representation of the naval rostra, that were not just properly the military instrument at sea. We've seen many videos now on ship's types, properly the literal rostra used as the symbol of the lute itself. You know, in the Roman oratory platform in the forum, there are the rostra proper, where the enemy ships' rostra were showed as, you know, display of Roman power even at sea. Then you have the corona ovalis, made of myrtle, that was enjoyed by the generals that entered Rome with the ovatio honors. Now, the right to ovation, rather than to triumph, was granted when the war won, of course, in this case, had, however, not been declared with the formal, in fact, the traditional formulas, right, that were normally connected with the fides, and that therefore had not been fought against a legitimate enemy, right? And there were many occasions in which, of course, the Roman commanders would find themselves entangled with, say, enemies that, you know, they hadn't had time to, say, consult the Senate in order to fight. There was also another instance, that is, for example, the war against a vile or undignified enemy, such as in the case of slaves and pirates. So a war against lesser people is not so important as a war against, like, free enemies that have properly been challenged to combat, like, directly. Described by Gellius, in which, quote, having the enemy depose suddenly the arms, the victory had been achieved. Here he literally says, he's a bit poetic, as a source has said, without dust, meaning without, he explains himself actually without tiredness and bloodshed, right? So without the dust, the clouds that would normally be arising during the fray, during the melee. And during the marches, by the way, for such ease in achieving this victory, it seems that the sacred wreath of Venus was more to be more apt, because the triumph was that rather than worthy of Mars, almost worthy of Venus, right? Because a way to say that these guys were some pussies, basically, kind of, right? There hadn't been bloodshed, so the Romans weren't happy. Well, I mean, they were happy, but they could have had a bit more fun, and actually just the fact that this had been a war, would bring serious consequences, and so we will see, if anything, what kind of what kind of consequences normally also the Roman bloodless victory would bloodily be carried out in some cases. According to Suetonius, Augustus 25:3, Augustus in the following years granted gladly torques and ornaments rather than coronae muralia and valaris that in fact entailed greater distinction, and he would confer them with greater sort of discretion, impartiality, if necessary, also to very simple soldiers. All right, it was a very important measure to again revitalize that sense of virtue, not just like some sort of Dionysian Uberist thinking about some venting of saying like we will now transform ourselves into kings because we have crowns. No, this would have been given just because of the modesty, but the dutiful acts of bravery that were suited to the dignified Roman mores, right? Individual citizens really doing their job, right? And that the Augustan policy was mostly about that. Gallius, again, in the Noctes Acticae 2:11, provides us with the portrait of Lucius Sicinius Dentatus, the Roman Achilles. We are in 454 BCE, so the source, as you know, is much later, and so this is a mythological time, almost. And he tells us that this Lucius, had fought in 120 battles, that he had been wounded 45 times, and never on his back, of course it was not a coward, that he had received 8 golden crowns, an obsidional one, 3 moral ones, 14 civic ones, 83 torques, more than 160 armillae, 18 hastae, 25 phalerae, etc. Of course, there is no proof. I don't think that Gallius literally had the evidence for this, but it could have been a saying, could have been part of an oral tradition. And again, maybe not exactly this guy with this name, with these specific decorations, but there had been a time in which, of course, these heroes, these champions, were brought on the battlefield because they were, horrifyingly battle-scarred veterans, just having seen it all before and just having come out of that hellish experience just because, literally climbed, and not because he hadn't died in the process, but because he literally climbed on the top of corpses back to the surface, right, back to heaven, right, and that was the actual point of it all, right. That the stress that the Romans still in later times had an incredibly primitive mindset, right, very very similar to the one of the tribal warriors, and especially the legionnaires were, with the only exception of being, in a sense, brutally disciplined and perfectly controlled in that sense, really could have not been otherwise, right? Now, there were other important rewards for the Roman soldier, such as the encomia and the public recognitions by the general of their deed, like as Polybius, so an external source, like relatively, from the Hellenic Word 639 tells us, quote, when in fact during a military action some of the Roman soldiers have fought with valor, the general, after having gathered the army assembly and having presented those that had been demonstrated having carried out some important enterprise, first praised each of them for their valor, and he remembers all the other actions carried out in their lives, right? Interestingly enough, like that deserve a positive mention, and eventually donates a javelin to whom has wounded an enemy, a cup if he had killed and spoiled him. All this if the guy, like the soldier rewarded, is an infantryman, right? If instead he was a knight, he would have been rewarded with phalerae, right? But in origin, like in the older times, only with a javelin, right? Which also tells you, like, more or less what kind of equipment this guys came from. I made a video about the development of Italic javelins between the 4th, the 3rd century BC. Now, Polybius goes on stressing the social importance of the decoration in a warlike society like the Roman one. Quote, with incentives like this, the Romans exhort to combativeness, to the spirit of emulation in battle. Not only those who learn of this, like hearing about it if present, but also those who remain at home, right? They try to, like, because these gifts were, as we've seen, also materially relevant, right? Those who have received such gifts, in fact, besides the glory among the troops, has an immediate fame at home. Also, after having come back there, participates to marches bearing these signs of distinction, so that these ornaments can be displayed only by those who have been rewarded by the generals for their own courage. Here the connection with the general is also relevant because, as we were saying before, the general was provided with the imperium officially by the Senate, and so these gifts, these rewards, were truly stemming physically from the same individuals that, as we've seen, were reputed, like in, say, ancient cultures tradition, to have like a divine power, to have an aura of, of divinity to some extent at least, due to the just God's glory, right? The Holy Ghost, literally, that they themselves had received as a reward for their value. So everything was understood as this enormous honor. It was really felt, perceived in the the collective spirit, right? The force laying under this Roman citizenry that, as changing throughout the centuries, was still the bulk of the imperial force, and as such was really deserving to be recognized by the same establishment, by the same aristocracy that not just also was often rewarded for their deeds, but that really had a responsibility for these people. They were often at-home clients, right? The same Marian reforms, as trigger further that process of attachment of the soldier to the to the great warlords. And in fact, this, as we've seen, standardization in the decorations, in the rewards, in the badges of honor, it really increases in the time in which there is a professionalization of the Roman army that is also connected with the personal connection of the soldier with that guy, right? That embodied like one model, of leadership of certain particular values. Again, think about a Caesar that boasted divine descent, like actually everybody, but mostly like from some of the best forces in that case, in terms of royal sacrality and more. So the Roman legionary would live within this metaphysical dimension for which he had to find his place in a world that was incredibly more miserable than our own, in which life cost much less, but that in this sense required much greater moral awareness. And these acts of heroism were in many ways the sort of the greatest ambition a person could have. Like, this is something I was debating today privately regarding probably how we have, like, also let's say humanity has weakened itself, is much less stressed, is much, in this sense, less, say, spineless, and this does affect every aspect of the contemporary world, including the military, in many ways. So and the attitude of the individual towards war. But that's something, say, more complex that we will see at some other point, right? For today, I think it's all, and of course there would be much more to say. These are just anecdotes, like citing this or that author, but in general, like there is a sort of much more complex, as I was saying in the beginning, also archaeological background. We're told that these decorations had sort of always been there in different ways. And of course, we're talking crowns, bracelets, badges, as long as war exists, like you always have this, right? And this was true also for pre-Roman times, and where the Romans themselves it sprang from. And it's extremely relevant to see that, like think about the torque, right? The torque was worn by the Romans literally, not just as you read on books, like because they were stripped from the enemies, they just wore them. Like, nobody explains you the meaning of the torque and how religiously and fervently driven in this heavy sense of hierarchy and divine connection the individual soldiers were through these items. Like, it's incredibly underrated and sort of overlooked in general, and it explains a lot better what war is, that, as von Clausewitz teaches, is primarily a struggle between moral forces. All right, so we will deepen like these topics better at some other point. We will see better how this changed across time, the centuries, what badges existed, like later on passing from the so-called republic to imperial times. Here we have been overlapping the two things in a sense, but there is probably more evidence also for later different quotes, of course, but also how things change in the late Roman period and beyond, right? That's something we don't make too often. But also the Middle Ages had something of this kind, and we have to appreciate this in many different ways. Now, for today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.